Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Bo Hopkins, a professor at Yale School of Management and the MacMillan Center. He has more than 30 years of private industry investment, management, and consulting experience, and he's been a managing partner with CM Equity Partners since 1999. His coursework at Yale has been designed to introduce graduate and undergraduate students to practical issues faced by mission-driven social entrepreneurs based in Africa, India, and other developing nations. Today, we'll talk with Professor Hopkins about the unique course he's currently teaching that uses market-based practices as a means to bring sustainable social benefits to locally impoverished regions of Africa. Welcome, Professor Hopkins.
Thank you, Meryl. Nice to be here.
So let's begin with the course that you're teaching. Tell us about it.
Okay, so this is for undergraduates.
Okay.
Usually sophomores rising to juniors or juniors rising to seniors. And the reason I say that is because it's a year-long class, and the class covers a calendar year, not an academic year.
Okay.
So if students in my class are sophomores right now, by the time they finish in December, they will obviously be juniors. The reason it's set up that way is because we're going to do in the first term sort of my pedagogical approach to what is social enterprise and the characteristics that make enterprises successful when they're principally driven by some social mission as opposed to a pure profit motivation. But what I really want the students to have an opportunity to do is work in the field with practitioners who are doing this. And so part of the summer months are set aside for the students to travel to, in this case, in this term, Africa, and in 3 or 4 different countries, we're still putting the project together, to explore the challenges on the ground, not just explore them sort of in the classroom in New Haven. So what we do is we have the pedagogical approach, then we have the summer experience for the students. They work in teams of 3, and then we have them come back to New Haven, and we not only deconstruct what their experiences were on the ground and how it differed from the classroom education part, but then we look at 3 different things. What is the project they worked on for their host client, and how do we advance their host client's mission by the work that the students do? So that's like a research project.
Right.
I want the students to write a case study about the experience so that they can articulate why this is, what their experience was and how it relates to the field of social enterprise in this example. And then in a case study, there's usually a teaching note. And so I work with the students on developing a teaching note so that we can actually use these cases in the future, whether at Yale or somewhere else.
Okay. And social enterprise, what exactly does that term mean in terms of the class you're teaching?
Well, a mission-driven enterprise is probably the easiest way to say it. I think of all businesses are social one way or the other. A mission-driven enterprise prioritizes bringing a certain good or service or value to a population that doesn't benefit the way we do from classic market-making opportunities. So if we think about some of the basic statistics, there are 7 billion people in the world, 4 billion of them live on less than $2 a day, $3 a day, depending on how you count purchasing power parity. And those individuals have needs, but they also have demands. And so how do needs and demands begin to interrelate? And as we think about building an organizational practice, an enterprise or a business, we sort of have to stop looking at needs a little bit and start thinking about demand. And how do we then think about bringing services or goods to satisfy a demand, or in some cases even help create that demand? So it's different from a philanthropic mission, and it's different from a pure for-profit mission.
Okay.
And we're looking at examples today of how these markets are created.
Okay. Why undergraduates and not, for instance, the graduate level?
You know, there's some great work going on at the graduate school. SOM has a great program on global social enterprise. We can see programs around other universities, mostly at the graduate level. What I think is great about the undergraduates is, A, they have the time. First of all, I'm in a 4-year program with them and not a 2-year program. So giving up a summer is a possibility from a practical standpoint of view. But they're energetic, they're inquisitive. They're not trying to find the answer, they're trying to find the questions, right? What is it that makes this work, not how does it work? In business school, the challenge is always how do you get to the answer, right? We're trying to figure out what are the questions. How do we get the students to formulate their ideas and their own hypothesis about this? So standard rule in my book is younger is better.
Okay. And how did you come to teach the course? What drew you to Yale? I know your background is financial primarily, so is there some overlap there?
Well, so my connection to Yale is through SOM. I was a graduate in the class of '86.
Okay.
And I've lived nearby, New York nearby, and I've remained involved with Yale. So I did a lot of volunteer work. AYA, SOM Alumni Association, the Yale Annual Fund. I've worked with all these organizations and just gotten to know more people in the community. And as that's happened, I've had an opportunity to interact with professors and talk about different ideas. And it was then the former dean of SOM who said, I'd really like you to help me brainstorm on a couple of class ideas. And we did that. And then he gave the assignment to teach it to somebody else, which was a good idea, but it opened my eyes to say, wow, there might be a way to do some work with Yale where I can actually get involved in the classroom and have even more opportunity to design my own questions and think about this space.
Right.
And then I got lucky. I met Jim Levinson and we were talking about this, and he said, I'd really like to have an experimental class with you and see if it works.
Okay.
And that was 7 years ago.
And here we are today. So the class is primarily based looking at Africa, correct?
So in this iteration, I'm appointed to the Africa Studies Department at MacMillan, and so we contextualize it around the continent of Africa, which is a pretty big place when you think about it. When I've done the class in the past, we've used the global canvas. So we've allowed students to sort of go where they want. So we've had students studying microfinance in Kyrgyzstan. We've had students looking at off-grid energy systems in northern India. We've had students look at mobile payment processing in Nicaragua. So all of those opportunities were sort of created by the students. Now that we're contextualizing it around Africa, I'm doing a little bit more work to help find the projects that fit the
Okay, and let's talk a little bit about that. So what are you doing?
The projects, or how do I find them?
And how do you find them?
Finding them is a classic networking opportunity or operation, right? So I start here at Yale, and we look at where are our alumni and where are the relationships, and then we start talking about who can I meet on the phone, who can I start talking about this idea of the classroom experience. Fortunately, I got enough years of experience in it where I can illustrate what I think the opportunities are for both the students and the host. And then I'll usually spend a few weeks in Africa over the summer myself prospecting, looking for organizations. As much as I can tie it back to Yale, I think that's a great thing.
Sure, sure. So let's talk about specifics. Let's talk about the class you're teaching now. Sure. Have the students identified what they're going to be doing this summer at this point?
Yes. So the advantage of me sort of doing some of the pre-screen work is we get earlier into the host relationship. And so we're working with 5 organizations, and each of them are in contact with the students at this point in time. What's going on, in addition to the pedagogy, is the students are beginning to make the relationships over Skype and over the phone with their hosts, starting to bring in some of the data that is available to them to start to understand how the business operations work. And we've done some work scoping the projects. What specifically will the students do when they're in the field in Kenya or Rwanda, say?
Okay, and what countries are being explored? I mean, where?
So it depends. I mean, we've had in this particular iteration, it looks like we're going to be a little heavy in Rwanda and Kenya. Right. I've had students in South Africa and 6 other countries in Africa over the life cycle of the course. But this time, it looks like it'll be Kenya and Rwanda for the most part.
Okay, looking back at some of the courses you've taught previously in the same manner, can you cite any specific examples that were particularly successful for the student, and why was it so successful?
So we have to be a little careful on what the definition of success is.
Okay.
I mean, so for the most part, I'm really just trying to get a student experience here. There's not really a product or a final element at the end, right? I want the students to be really open-minded, to have a chance to explore in this interesting new space, and to contribute. But at the end of the class assignment, that's really as far as we're really taking it.
Okay.
Having said that, there are always some really fun success stories. And so I've had a chance to teach at the Global Affairs Department, Africa Studies now, School of Management, and the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. So I'll give you one example from applied sciences,
Okay.
and I'll give you one example from global affairs. In the applied sciences class, I worked in the Center for Engineering Innovation Design with Professor Joe Zinter, and we did a class called Appropriate Technology for the Developing World. And one of the things that we used as a prompt one year was the cold chain, the vaccine cold chain. And that's a system that the students had to learn about as to how drugs are manufactured in one place, need to be kept within a certain temperature band throughout their entire supply chain distribution, or they lose their efficacy.
Right.
And how do you get a drug or a series of drugs all the way through that chain to the last mile in a regional area of Africa or India, or you pick the place.
Right.
We asked the students to come up with several different hypotheses around how, once they studied the cold chain and did interviews around who the actors and the principal mechanisms for delivery were, to brainstorm on different ideas as what they would do if they were engaged in this space. And one student team really wanted to learn about the demand side of the equation at the final last mile. So they postulated it was at the time a bracelet, it became a necklace, which has ultimately become an organization called Cushy Baby, where they can read and write the vaccine record on any individual baby's health card electronically. So we use a mobile phone to go out into the field and bring back and write data. Here's when the baby was vaccinated, or here's why the baby wasn't vaccinated, and then we can bring that information back and upload it into the cloud. Now we have a full working database, as opposed to an analog record of notebooks.
Sure.
Students took that out of the classroom, won a couple of prizes, got a little capital to go to India, trial it with a host partner, and today, 3.5 years later, they're working with over 900 villages, mostly in Udaipur, or around Jaipur and Udaipur, we said in Rajasthan, Udaipur being the headquarters, and are constantly innovating the model that they have. Great success from a standpoint of view of a classroom idea getting into the field.
Sure.
In the Jackson Global Affairs Department, oftentimes we'll have the students write cases and submit them to a case competition. One of the cases in 2015 came in first place in an international case competition. It was 70 different cases applied, mostly written by professors, some graduate students, and our undergraduates came in first and third out of the 3 places. So it was really kind of fun.
Yeah, that's great. And quite a testament to you, I'm sure, as a teacher as well.
It's just fun. That's just fun. That's just fun.
Now, when you're in the classroom and the students are formulating their projects, I'm curious to, there's always the theoretical of, formulating, something in a classroom and then hitting the reality when you're in the field. Let's talk about some of the situations that have come up in that area.
Well, so there's different kinds of challenges, right? The first challenge is, can we actually build a project which has the right scale and scope that students can contribute to? It's frustrating to the students and to organizations if there's a mismatch there, because the students can end up being subtractive from the whole enterprise, right? They take time, they take energy, they got to be managed to some extent. If they're not on the ground contributing, then it's a subtraction.
Right.
We try to avoid that by doing a lot of the scoping work up front and building the client relationship very early on. After that, it's the student travel experience, right? Now, we had students who were flying to Kenya on the exact day to meet their client on the exact day that there was the bombing in Nairobi's mall. Well, that shut everything down. I had students stranded in Dubai. I had students who hadn't left yet. I had another student in London. And they were all trying to figure out how they were going to get together and make it work. And they did pull it together and make it work. But it was not the ideal scenario. So there are practical challenges to the kind of things we do, and there are structural challenges to the kinds of things that we do. And it takes a lot of time with me to try to help make sure that all those things go as smoothly as possible.
How about any surprises? You've been teaching now for a few years. Is there anything that potentially could surprise you at this point? Or
I don't even want to think about that.
Or something that says, wow, I didn't think about that, during the course of you teaching for the past few years.
So look, there have been 60 kids that have gone out in the field and 60 kids that have all come back. And
And that's a good
they've
thing.
all had a great experience, and the organizations are generally pretty happy with how it works. I think that the surprises are, because I see the kids for a year, I should say students, they're going to laugh at me now when they hear me say that. When I see the students for a year, I really get to develop a little bit of a relationship with them. So I can see how they're also evolving in their thinking as the terms go by. But look, the biggest surprises and the best of things are all is when I get an email from a student who is actually in the space, working in the field. We had two students work in Ghana with an organization called MicroInsure. That was their summer project, and they took full-time positions with that organization at the end of the year. And so, or the end when they graduated. So one worked in Ghana, the other worked in Kenya for a year. The one who spent time in Ghana is now working with an organization called the Africa Leadership Universities in Mauritius, and it's a very ambitious program where they're building 25 different universities around Africa to educate the next level of leadership for Africa, the for Africans by Africans, and it's terrific. And I know the founder of that organization, but that was just coincidental to the fact that this student ended up there. So a surprise for me is when I hear about that. And his name is Michael, and Michael came back this first day of class this term, and so then he was there in front of the class, addressing the students exactly where he had been 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Terrific.
That is a wonderful opportunity, I think, for the students. So ultimately, what would you like your students to take away from your class?
Social enterprise, as we said earlier, is a mission-driven focus. It's looking at where problems are in the world and trying to think of the tools that could be used, which go beyond just pure philanthropy, which is great, or donated time, to thinking about the organizational construction of how to fundamentally address these pervasive problems. And it doesn't have to be in the developing world. It can happen right here. It can happen right in New Haven. There are big disparities in income, as we understand, right? So how do you take what is a relatively lower income part of a population and redesign a good or a service that helps that individual or those communities build themselves up, right?
Right.
My approach to thinking about it is to use the market mechanisms, and that's the structure that we use inside the classroom. And so that goes to how do we think about business creation? How do we gear our activities? How do we keep costs low? How do we build a relationship with the customer? Those types of activities are important because we have such a thin margin to work with. Oftentimes you'll see these organizations have two arms. One is philanthropic and one is business, because the philanthropic part, the building of the network or the building of the infrastructure to support the business, isn't really market-based, but parts of it can be. And so that leads to long-term sustainability. In the end, Marilyn, look, I went to SOM, right? We think about, business for leaders for business and society, right? How do we think that through at a young age level, right? How do we just ask the questions and get them thinking about it? Because whether they go to Goldman Sachs or they go to McKinsey or they go to UNICEF or wherever they end up going, they're gonna be engaged in this throughout their lives. And if we have that dialogue now, and they have an experience that they can remember now, I think it's transformative. And so that's my theory of change for how to influence the students.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay, great. For more information about Professor Hopkins and his work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.